Good morning, this is Weary with MetaArchitects HUB, and today we're going to be looking at 3 default settings in Blender that you'll want to be aware of, and you're probably going to want to change if you're trying to create and export a perfect loop animation. To keep things relatively straight to the point, we'll be focusing more on what is happening than why, because why gets complex. To demonstrate this, we'll be starting with a new template file in Blender version 3.5, deleting a few default elements we don't need, like the light and the inner collection. We will, however, be keeping the camera and the cube. Now, for this next part, bear with me because I'm going to be adding some elements that are really just for visualization purposes so that you can see at a glance where the cube is in its animation cycle. To do that, I'm going to use a trick where I add an empty and then I parent some things to it. Empties are extremely useful tools in Blender. Like the name suggests, they have no visual physical properties themselves, but you can parent other things to them, and then whatever you parent to them will do whatever you make the empty do. Think of it as a wrapper. So what I'm going to do here is take a text tool, and I'm going to go ahead and rotate it 90 degrees because I want to start with this side that is facing the camera. And I'm going to go ahead and center align it, which you can actually do vertically as well as horizontally. Once that's done, I am going to change the text to our first number, 1. Now you'll notice that that is nicely placed right at the center of the cube. A bit too literally because it's actually inside of the cube. So I'm going to change to wireframe mode and use the very handy snapping tool, specifically the edge snapping. Now, what's interesting with the snapping tool is it will snap to, with the default settings, whichever you are closest to. So I want it on the outside of the cube. So what I'm going to do is actually add some extrusion first because we want this to have a small amount of dimension, not too much, not too little. That's a pretty good amount. Now, since we added the extrusion while it was snapped to the edge, it added it on either side. We want the number to be on the outside of the cube, so we just snap it out and then snap it back, and like a magnet, it is now attached to the outside of the cube as we want. So next, what we want to do is duplicate this for the other numbers for all 4 sides. So I'm just gonna shift duplicate this. Once I have 4 copies, I am going to change the names to actually reflect what they're meant to be. So just 1, 2, 3, 4. Because when you create a duplicate, it creates the next copy as 0.001, which gets confusing with numbering. So now that we have those, we're going to want to actually edit what is inside it to reflect what it's supposed to be. So 1, 2, 3, 4 again. Now the text tool can be a little bit annoying, as you saw right there. The text tool has a slightly different interface than a lot of other tools in Blender. For example, you need to hit Tab in order to edit the text, and once you do, the default click action is to move the cursor away. So hence the random S that popped up and me needing to move the cursor back to world origin. Now, we got our number 2. So just going to do the same thing for 3 and 4. Once we have those, we're going to want to parent them to that new empty that we created. If you don't know what parenting is, go look it up. It's really important. There are a few different ways to parent objects in Blender. One of the easier ones is to just go into your outliner tree in the right, and you just shift, click, and drag it onto the empty or wherever you want to be parenting it to. So once we do that, we are going to do as the empty indicates and rotate it. Now see how the attached number that we just parented moves with it? That is exactly what we want. So what we're going to do is we are just going to repeat that process for each of these numbers. But before we do, there's something to note here. See how as I'm rotating this, it's a little bit wobbly, and then I have to go into the rotation box and manually change it to 90 degrees instead of those random decimals. So you can make your life a lot easier by going to the snap tool and selecting rotate and scale as well while you're in there if you want. The default is just move, but if you do rotate as well, then when you go to rotate something, you'll see that it does a nice little snap to the nearest whole number degree, which you'll see here as we continue in wireframe mode with the next number. Now, to get back to it, the reason that we're doing this is it is effectively making it so that there is a number on each side of the cube. Now, what's handy about that is we're doing that without actually having to join the text to the mesh of the cube. For that, we would need to turn the text into actual meshes and all of that. And you can if you want, but it's just a little bit cleaner and much easier to edit if you just instead use parenting within an empty. So that is kind of why we're using that trick instead of actually making these like literally connected to the cube mesh. So we can just kind of pop them off here and move it around. It just gives you a lot more freedom, which is always nice before you're ready to seal up your final export. Now, we do want the cube to move with those, however. So again, without having to join, we can simply do the same thing that we did with the numbers and parent the cube to the same empty. Now, if we go ahead and move the empty around, we'll see that the cube rotates with the numbers, which again is exactly what we want. All right, now that we have the demo object prepped, we can dig into the animation. To create a perfect loop in Blender, there are going to be 3 defaults in particular that you want to pay attention to. These are the starting frame, the frame rate plus frame range, and interpolation. Starting out, we're going to look at the starting frame, which is right here. See, it says 1. That's the default in Blender. Makes sense, right? When we start counting, we start at 1. What doesn't make sense is that if you start at 1, your animation will hitch. It actually needs to start at 0. Why? I don't know, it's a whole thing apparently. Next thing to pay attention to is the frame rate. FPS stands for frames per second, and 24 is the default. I like to leave it there. It's what they use in most movies because that's what sort of looks good to the human eye in film, and it's a nicely divisible number, which is part of the reason they use that. But what does not make sense is, notice how here the default is 24 frames per second, and yet the frame range is 250. Now, I'm not great at math, but 24 times 10 is 240. That would be 10 seconds.
By default, however, the frame range ends at 250, which is weird, and I'm going to show you why. All I can think is that maybe they chose 250 because you could divide 1,000 by 250 4 times. I don't know. I looked into it. I really couldn't find anything. So what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and add a blue material so that our numbers kind of stand out more against the cube rather than just the default material where everything is white. Now, here in the animation timeline window, I'm going to go to the view menu and select the option to turn on show seconds. What that does is instead of showing us the frames in the animation, it shows us the actual time. So you can see, without having to do the math, how many seconds into an animation you'd be. So if we go back and deselect that, we can go back to the frames and see how everything matches up, right? Now, I'll note that this isn't something you need to do for the loop animation. I typically only work in frames per second rather than the actual second timeline. This is just something I'm doing to show you that it's weird. So what you can do is to make sure that everything's lining up as makes sense. So see at 24 frames, it is 1 second exactly, right? Do the same thing and scroll over to 240 and you can confirm that yes, that is 240 frames per second is 10 seconds math, right? And over at 250, where it ends by default, you can see that it's 10 seconds plus 10 fractions of a second. Doesn't really make sense, right? So just to keep things clean, I just like to end my animations in multiples of 24. You can change where the frame range ends in several places, one of which is the Output Properties tab on the right. You can also change it in the bottom right of your animation timeline, where I'll often change it because it's faster, but either works. You just type in your new ending. In this case, 240 frames per second, which will end it at a clean 10 seconds. Now that we have our frame rate and our frame range set to what we want in this case, which is 24 FPS and 240 frames, we can go ahead and begin to keyframe the animation. This is where I'll show you the strange hitch that occurs if you keyframe your animation with a starting frame of 1 instead of 0. The shortcut for that is I on the keyboard. Now, note that you need to have the object you want to keyframe selected, otherwise it will give you an error. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to animate the empty. We don't actually want to animate what's inside the empty, because then we would have to animate each one of those. And since we want them all to have the same animation, we're just going to keyframe the empty. So hit I, And for this, we're going to do rotation because we just want to show a clean rotating loop that rotates on into infinity. As you can see in the default dope sheet view in your animation timeline, that has added a keyframe at frame 1 where your marker was, which is specific to rotation. Now we want to be in the right-hand tab of object properties for this, where you can see the current status of your keyframed animation. You'll note that the colors change depending on where you are in your timeline and what is happening there. So for example, right now it's showing green because at 240 at the end of the animation where we want to rotate it, it is not keyframed. Note how after rotating the empty at frame 240, the z-axis has changed to the orange color and there is a value. This indicates that there is a keyframe addition pending. However, it is not animated yet. What we want to do in this case is get a clean 360 rotation. Like earlier when we were parenting the numbers to the empty, you can tweak this after rotating it in the lower left in the rotate box, or you can just enter the value you want in the right hand in the object properties. Once you're ready, just click that little diamond on the right and see how it turns yellow. That means that you now have a keyframed animation from 1 to 240. At this point, you might be wondering, why did he keyframe it at frame 1 when he said to keyframe it at frame 0? This is valid. However, I still need to show you the hitching that occurs if you keyframe it at frame 1. And in order to do that, we need to jump ahead to the third default you need to know about, which is called interpolation. Interpolation is a complex mathematical term that we're not going to really dig into because even if I read you the definition in regard to Blender, you'd just be like, So instead, I'm just going to show you what to do. With your keyframe selected, right-click and go to interpolation mode and then change it to linear. If you're looking closely before, you would see that the rotation kind of starts slow and then speeds up at the middle and then slows down again. That is the default. Change it to linear, we get a sort of constant turntable rotation that can just go on into infinity. Now, were you looking closely? See at the end, at 240? This is why we have the numbers there, and really the whole purpose of this tutorial is to show you the hitch that occurs. Because really, this is probably one of the most frustrating parts of getting a perfect loop animation, and it took me and many other people a really long time to figure out what was happening and how to fix it. So watch closely each time this reaches the end of its animation where it loops. It's going to look like a FPS hitch, right? If you ever played a video game and your frame rate like slows down all of a sudden in the middle of a really hectic scene, you'll be kind of familiar with that. It's a little bit hard to spot, but it really is something that just you want to clean out because in larger projects, it's going to drive you crazy and just not look very clean. So what I'm doing is I'm just replaying near the end so you can really try to see that hitch that occurs that we want to get rid of. Now the good news is at this point, after you have everything else kind of set up, it's really easy to fix, at least with a basic animation. All you need to do is drag that starting keyframe animation from frame 1 to frame 0. And like magic, you should now have a perfect loop. Now, as I replay the animation from a few different views, just remember to watch right where it loops to look for that hitch, which should now be gone. While this plays, I'm going to mention some caveats related to perfect loops in this tutorial, namely being that this is obviously a really simple example, right? As your animations get more complex and you keyframe in more elements like location or scale, you're going to run into different issues and things are going to get weird, right? That's just the nature of 3D development. However, that's also why it's important to have a stable foundation to build on. The more variables you can exclude that might throw a literal hitch in your process down the road, the better. A lot of this might seem like common sense, but it's not, because that's just how it's set up, and it's not really explained why. I think most of us probably didn't go to college for Blender if you're here looking at YouTube tutorials for this, and so it's something you kind of just end up figuring out through trial and error on your own if you're like me. So hopefully this has been helpful and will remove some of that frustrating process that I had to figure out on my own. Now, the last step, of course, is to export this, and I'm going to export it as a GLB file, as that is the format that I use in my metaverse builds, which is what a lot of this is for. If you have any questions or you just want to chat with other builders, please feel free to join us at the MetaArchitects HUB. I will drop a link to our Discord in the description below. As we say in Web3, GM.